Ladies and gents, welcome back. Today we want to finish off our Late Invoices widget by adding in the invoices themselves. Before we do that, we want to prepare our container for adding those invoices. If I open this up, you'll see that this invoices list is actually scrollable, so we need to add that scroll capability to our container. So let's go back to our previous box here. In here, we want to add a scroll view widget, which is what deals with the actual scrolling. Next, let's go ahead and size this scroll view so that it knows how much area it has for scrolling. In our case, since we are scrolling vertically, we want the scroll view to have a height of the parent height, which is the box layout's height. Next, let's define how the scroll view should scroll. In this case, we want it to scroll vertically only. This list represents horizontal and vertical scroll. So on the x-axis, we don't want it to scroll, but on the y-axis, we want it to scroll. Next, let's define the widget we want to scroll. We'll use a grid layout here. Let's give this grid layout an ID so we can reference it in Python. Now let's define how this grid layout should align its children. Since we want to vertically align our children, we set the call property to 1. This means we only want one column in our grid, which effectively makes our grid put its children in rows, thus aligning them vertically. Now let's size this grid layout so that it knows the bounds for its children. We'll set the size hint y to none so that we can set the height of this grid to be the minimum height allowed for a grid layout. This makes it such that the grid occupies the least space possible but grows as its children are added. Now let's go ahead and add some spacing to this grid layout's children so that they don't stick to each other. That's it. So now if I were to go in here and add a background box and give it a red color for visualization, then set its size hint y to none and set its height to 54 pixels. I could now run this and see how our grid looks so far. Lovely. Now duplicate this and let's test alignment. Looking good. So with that done, let's go ahead and actually start creating the invoices widget. So go to our dashboard Python file, go to the bottom here, and then let's create a new class. We'll call this invoice item. All right, as always, we need to initialize this class and pass on the arguments to the parent box layout. Next, let's define the properties for our new widget. The first property will be the invoice ID, and then we are also going to need the date that invoice was created, and then finally, the total price on that invoice. That's it. Let's go ahead and start styling this. Let's go to the dashboard styles file, then scroll all the way to the bottom. In here, define the invoice item class to tell Kivy the next styles belong to the invoice item widget. Next, let's size our invoice. This is important. On a grid layout, normally you don't need to define the size for your widgets, but if the grid layout is inside a scroll view, you need to define the prevalent size for your widgets. So define height if it's a vertical scroll view, or width if it's a horizontal scroll view. This is so that the scroll view knows when your widgets are no longer fitting in your grid layout so that it starts scrolling. Remember I said our grid layout grows as we add children to it. So we'll set the size hint y to none so that we can set the height of this invoice item to 42 pixels. Instead of using our previous canvas method to create the background this time, we'll just use our background box. And now let's define the properties for our background box. So in this case, we want the border color to be the divider color. Then we want this border to only show up at the bottom of our background box. Next, let's also add some spacing to the children of this background box. With that, we can start adding the children. To save ourselves some time, let's simply copy the labels we added before for the headers, since the layout is pretty much the same. So copy all of this up to here. Next, go back to our invoices widget and simply paste in that code in the background box. Now let's make sure we indent this correctly to avoid errors. Now to test this, let's go back to our grid layout and add a new invoice item. Let's set its properties. So first, set the invoice ID. Next, set the price property. Then finally, when this invoice was created, which is the date posted property. If I save this now and simply run this, you'll see that we have our invoice here, which says invoice number because we copied this. So now let's add in those properties in here so that the invoice reflects what the invoice data is. Now if we look at our app, you notice that the fonts are different for the invoice number and price. Let's fix our app to reflect this. So first, change the text property to use the invoice ID property. Next, change the color of our text to be the primary color. Next, we want this text to appear underlined as seen in our app demo. Next, let's go to the price label, and in here, let's just set the color to be the primary text color. Now for the last label, let's horizontally align its text to the right. Finally, let's change the text properties to reflect the invoice data as well. So in this case, we want to give our date label an ID because we will set the date dynamically in Python. Because if you check in our app, it doesn't display the date itself, but rather how long ago the invoice was created. Because of that, we should set the text property to nothing by default. For the price, we will set the text property to be the price property prepended with a $sign. Now let's run this and see what we currently have. Looks like we get a small error, and that error is because of this typo. Let's fix that and run this again. All right, so we have our invoice number, we have our price here, and we have our date. What I'll do next is move the date header to the right as well. So close this out, and let's go back to where that date is. Now set the horizontal alignment to right. Now if we run this again, it should now be aligned to the right, which is exactly what we want. Next, let's fix our date display issue. So let's go to our Python here. And then since we want to deal with the date, what we want to do is to bind to the date property so that when the date changes, we also update as needed. So bind to the date property using the on__ method. What we want to do now is create a new datetime object from our given date. Make sure to import datetime from datetime. So I'm just going to do this from Visual Studio Code like that. Next, let's get the difference from when this invoice was created to now so that we can know if it was a week ago, a day ago, a month ago, and so on. Next, let's calculate how many months ago this invoice was created. Next, let's also calculate how many weeks ago the invoice was created. Now, given the months and weeks, let's create our date string to say, for example, a few months ago or a week ago. Let's first initialize our date string to simply say today. Let's first take care of the situation where the invoice was created more than a month ago. If that's the case, we want to change our string to say that many months ago. So if months is 2, the string will read as 2 months ago. Next, let's deal with when it's only 1 month ago. In that case, our text property is going to say a month ago. Next, if months is 0, let's check the weeks. So if weeks is equal to 1, then we'll just say a week ago. Next, let's deal with when weeks is greater than 1, but less than a month. In that case, we just want to spit out how many weeks that was. Next, if weeks is less than 6, we'll just set the date string to say a few days ago. Finally, if none of these conditions is true, we will just say the text for our date will simply say how many days ago that was. Now, given our string, we now want to set our date labels text to this string. Now save this, and let's go back to our Kivy file. Now go to the grid layout and simply duplicate the invoice items a couple times. Now let's run this and see our invoice items in action. Looking awesome. Let's change the properties around for our invoices to see the different properties in action. After changing these a bit, let's run it again and see what we get. So you see it says a week ago, 22 months ago, 20 months ago, 10 months ago, because of those date changes I made. Of course, you can extend this to also account for years if you want, but for our use case, this is where we'll leave it. Because of the scroll view widget, you'll notice that this list also scrolls as well. That's it for this tutorial. All the code for this tutorial will be in the link in the description of this video. If you enjoyed this content, be sure to like this video to get it recognized more, and subscribe to our channel for more content like this. You can also join our Patreon membership to get access to exclusive content and also help out this channel. Thanks for watching. See you next time.